From New York, this is Democracy Now!
There are millions of people all around the world who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change. Denying this fact could be interpreted by some to be a crime against humanity. Thank you.
The United Nations Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain, ends in monumental failure as negotiators fail to agree on a deal to limit global warming. But grassroots organizing on the climate crisis is at an unprecedented level.
Society has been shut out of this COP. Our lives, children and future generations are in your hands, and you are failing us.
We'll get response from Asad Rehman with War on Want in London, and from Cape Town, South Africa, Tasneem Essab, Executive Director of the Climate Action Network International. Then, back at home, the House Judiciary Committee is poised to vote to impeach President Trump this week. Next step, a Senate trial.
Everything I do during this, I'm coordinating with White House counsel. There will be no difference between the president's position and our position as to how to handle this.
We'll get response from three-time presidential candidate, consumer activist Ralph Nader. He's calling for impeaching Trump for deliberately abetting the climate crisis, among other issues. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Madrid, Spain, the COP25 United Nations Climate Summit ended in failure Sunday after negotiators failed to agree to a deal that would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, a key goal of the Paris Agreement. Scores of civil society groups condemn governments in the European Union, Australia, Canada, and the U.S. for blocking progress at the talks. Alden Meyer, strategy chief at the Union of Concerned Scientists, said, quote, "Never have I seen the almost total disconnect we've seen here at COP25 in Madrid between what the science requires and what the climate negotiations are delivering in terms of meaningful action." Ian Fry, the climate negotiator for the Pacific island nation of Tuvalu, whose existence is threatened by rising sea levels, called out the United States for watering down the final document, even though President Trump is withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement.
This is an absolute tragedy and a travesty on those affected by the impacts of climate change. There are millions of people all around the world who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change. Denying this fact could be interpreted by some to be a crime against humanity. Thank you.
Environmentalists and indigenous leaders blasted the United Nations for marginalizing civil society groups over 2 weeks of negotiations while welcoming polluters at the climate summit. This is Kira Sherwood-O'Regan, a Maori representative from the indigenous peoples organizations at the COP.
When you silence us, you deny yourselves learning from our ways, and you continue to sideline those who have real solutions for all communities. We are experts on climate. We are the kaitiaki, the stewards of nature. We know the legitimacy of our voices, and it's about time that you recognized it too. Hear our stories, learn our histories, stop taking up space with your false solutions, and get out of our way.
We'll have more on the failures of COP25 Climate Summit. We'll be joined by Asad Rehman from London, as well as Tasneem Essab, who is Executive Director of the Climate Action Network from Cape Town, South Africa. On Capitol Hill, the House Judiciary Committee has released its report explaining its decision to charge President Trump with 2 articles of impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The 658-page report released this morning details Trump's efforts to withhold military aid in order to pressure Ukraine to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. On Wednesday, the full Democratic-controlled House is expected to vote to impeach President Trump, sending the charges goes to the Republican-controlled Senate, which will then hold a trial on whether to remove Trump from office. On Sunday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer proposed terms for an evidentiary trial that would start on January 7th and go beyond the investigation conducted by the House. Witnesses who could be called to testify include former National Security Advisor John Bolton and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. This comes as top Republican senators face calls to recuse themselves from Trump's impeachment trial. Late last week, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told Fox News he was, quote, taking my cues, quote, from the White House. And on Sunday, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was questioned by Face the Nation host Margaret Brennan about coordinating with the White House on impeachment.
Should Republicans in the Senate really be taking their marching orders from the person being investigated?
You know, I understand the president's frustration, but I think what's best for the country is to get this thing over with. I am clearly made up my mind. I'm not trying to hide the fact that I have disdain for the accusations in the process.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he may not have any witnesses at the Senate trial. We'll have more on Trump's impeachment later in the broadcast with Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, and former presidential candidate. The Trump administration's reportedly planning to withdraw 4,000 U.S. troops from Afghanistan, with President Trump set to make an announcement as early as this week. The drawdown would leave between 8,000 and 9,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, continuing to fight the longest war in U.S. history, now in its 19th year. This comes just days after a major expose by the Washington Post revealed senior U.S. officials lied throughout the war in Afghanistan about progress while hiding evidence it had become unwinnable. In India, the death toll from a crackdown on demonstrations has risen to 6 as massive protests rage against the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which many have denounced as a major step toward the official marginalization of India's 200 million Muslims. Among the dead were 4 people shot dead by police in Assam state's biggest city, Guwahati, where government-imposed curfews closed schools and brought commerce to a halt. The citizenship bill passed by the upper house of the Indian parliament provides a path to citizenship for immigrants from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, unless they are Muslim. In Bangladesh, at least 10 people were killed after a fire tore through a factory near the capital Dhaka Sunday. A local fire official said the 3-story building clearly had no safety measures. The deadly blaze came just 4 days after fire to Dhaka Plastics factory killed 19 people. In Lebanon, government forces fired tear gas and water cannons at thousands of protesters who flooded the streets of Beirut for a second straight day Sunday, dispersing a peaceful rally calling for an end to official corruption and economic inequality. Protesters responded by throwing rocks and setting trash cans on fire. Dozens of people were arrested. This is protester Nadine Farhat.
We will not leave until they submit to our demands. They are the ones who stole the country. They are the ones who brought us to this point, not us. We are citizens who want our rights. What we are asking for is not something that the political elite own. It is actually our own rights that they took away from us.
Lebanon has been rocked by weeks of massive anti-government demonstrations that forced Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri to resign. Back in the United States, a state judge in Wisconsin has ordered 234,000 names to be purged from the voter rolls ahead of the 2020 election, in a move decried by critics as a Republican-backed effort at voter suppression. Under the ruling, registered voters who did not respond to a letter within 30 days asking them to confirm their home address will be forced to re-register or will be ineligible to vote next year. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a majority of the voters who were sent the letters were in districts that leaned Democratic in the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump won Wisconsin by fewer than 23,000 votes that year. Ben Wickler, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, called the purge a, quote, product of a right-wing legal and political strategy to prevent eligible voters from voting, adding, it should be a concern to anyone who believes in the core idea of democracy, he said. New Jersey Democratic Congressmember Jeff Van Drew will switch parties and become a Republican. Van Drew's announcement came over the weekend after he met President Trump at the White House Friday after news of his defection broke. 5 of Van Drew's top staffers resigned in protest. Van Drew is opposed to the impeachment of President Trump. In media news, the Hallmark Channel says it'll resume airing advertisements from the wedding planning company Zola that feature same-sex couples. Hallmark initially banned 4 ads featuring brides kissing each other, while accepting 2 similar ads that featured heterosexual couples. After a backlash, Hallmark CEO Mike Perry reversed course and apologized Sunday night, saying in a statement, "We are truly sorry for the hurt and disappointment this has caused." Pentagon officials say they're investigating students at the Army's West Point Academy and the U.S. Naval Academy after they were filmed flashing white power hand gestures at the Army-Navy football game in Philadelphia Saturday. Army cadets and Navy midshipmen in the stands were seen repeatedly making the signs which resemble an OK gesture, and one such incident was broadcast live by ESPN. Last year, the U.S. Coast Guard reprimanded an officer who used a similar hate symbol during a TV broadcast. And executives at Boeing are reportedly considering ending production of the troubled 737 MAX passenger jet, and an announcement could come as early as this afternoon after markets close. Boeing's 737 MAX airplane has been grounded worldwide after 2 crashes in Ethiopia and Indonesia killed all 346 people on board the 2 planes. Last week, former Boeing manager Edward Pearson testified to the House Transportation Committee. He tried to warn executives about safety concerns 4 months before the first deadly crash, as well as before the second crash, but his warnings were ignored.
I requested a one-on-one meeting with the general manager on July 18th and repeated my recommendation to shut down the factory for a brief period of time. When I mentioned that I've seen operations in the military shut down for lesser safety concerns, I will never forget his response, which was, "The military isn't a profit-making organization."
We'll get response from consumer activist Ralph Nader, who lost his grandniece, Samia Stumo, who was on the Ethiopian flight. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We are just back from Madrid, Spain, where COP25, the United Nations Climate Summit, ended in a monumental failure Sunday after negotiators failed to agree to a deal that would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, a key goal of the Paris Agreement. Scores of civil society groups condemned governments in the European Union, Australia, Canada, and the United States for a deal that requires far less action than needed to avert catastrophic climate change. Alden Meyer, the strategy chief at the Union of Concerned Scientists, said, quote, "Never have I seen the almost total disconnect we've seen here at COP25 in Madrid between what the science requires and what the climate negotiations are delivering in terms of meaningful action." Ian Fry, the climate negotiator for the Pacific island nation of Tuvalu, whose existence is threatened by rising sea levels due to global warming, called out the United States, which worked to water down the final agreement, even though President Trump is withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement.
This is an absolute tragedy and a travesty on those affected by the impacts of climate change. There are millions of people all around the world who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change. Denying this fact could be interpreted by some to be a crime against humanity. Thank you.
Environmentalists, indigenous leaders blasted the United Nations for marginalizing civil society groups over 2 weeks of negotiations at the climate summit, sometimes kicking them out of the summit while welcoming polluters. This is Kira Sherwood-O'Regan, a Maori representative from the indigenous peoples organizations at the COP.
When you silence us, you deny yourselves learning from our ways, and you continue to sideline those who have real solutions for all communities. We are experts on climate. We are the kaitiaki, the stewards of nature. We know the legitimacy of our voices, and it's about time that you recognized it too. Hear our stories, learn our histories, stop taking up space with your false solutions, and get out of our way.
For more on the outcome of the UN Climate Summit, we're joined by two guests who were there. Now in London, Asad Rehman is Executive Director of War on Want. And from Cape Town, South Africa, Tasneem Essop is Executive Director of the Climate Action Network International. She's joining us via Democracy Now! Video stream. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Tasneem, let's begin with you. You were there right through to the end. You organized the response on Sunday when the final COP closed. Can you talk about why it's being described as a monumental failure, even by negotiators? And then, though, the success or the unprecedented level of organizing that's going on coming out of the summit?
Yes, Amy, thank you very much for having me on the show. This, for once, I think, across the board, many parties and civil society organizations and activists from different constituencies, the trade union movement, indigenous peoples, women, and gender, have had one voice about the outcome of this COP, and that it is a failure. The clear gap between the reality on the outside of this process, whether that is the science that's become clearer with the 1.5 report, whether it is the voices of many citizens in many countries across the world demanding a response to the climate emergency, and in addition to that, the impacts already being felt in countries across the world. The disconnect inside the halls of the UNFCCC with key countries like the US, Australia, Japan was phenomenal. And not only were these, these countries the key blockers in the process, we also had Brazil added to that mix as well. And so it's very clear that the commitment to addressing this climate emergency, and in fact, the commitment to the Paris Agreement was not demonstrated at all. And this outcome clearly points in that direction.
You mentioned Brazil. Now let's talk about the history of this particular COP, Conference of Parties. The 25th Conference of Parties was supposed to be held in Brazil. But then the man many call the Trump of Brazil, the right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, in one of his first acts, canceled the COP in Brazil. It was then moved to Chile, and the right-wing president there, in the midst of social upheaval like Chile hasn't seen in decades, the protests that are going on there, he canceled the COP, but Chile still presided over the COP in Madrid, Spain. It was moved there in the last weeks. So you have Jair Bolsonaro, a climate denier, and you have President Trump. Now, Trump is pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It would officially be pulled out the day after the election next year. Yet how did they wield so much power at this COP?
Well, they're not out of the process yet. That will happen next year officially. And they wielded a lot of power. There were stories about negotiators in the loss and damage negotiations saying they were literally being bullied by the US negotiators. So they've played an extremely destructive role, particularly in the loss and damage negotiations pertaining to finance for loss and damage. And so, this is unbelievable.
And explain, I'm always trying to break down UN language, loss and damage.
Well, this is the impacts of climate change, the losses that you would have, as we're already witnessing across the world, whether through floods, the damage that is experienced through devastating typhoons, as we've seen, for example, in the Philippines, the devastation caused by fires, as we have seen in Australia. So it's the losses and the damage related to that. It's not only about the extreme events like these that cause loss and damage, but something called slow onset. So sea level rise, for example, would be a slow onset. It's not an extreme event that happens all at once. And this is exactly what the small island states are talking about in terms of their survival. Already, they're experiencing sea level rise, and many are being forced to move. So displacement and migrancy is also part of the impacts of climate change that would need to be addressed.
Asad Rehman, we're speaking to you in London. You actually left a few days before the end of the summit yesterday because you went back to London to deal with, well, the election that took place there, the landslide election for the Prime Minister Boris Johnson over the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, what some, like George Monbiot, have called the climate election. Others called it Brexit. But can you talk about, in your time there, and we see you every year at these climate summits, the significance of why this year was so devastating and so monumentally a failure?
Well, I mean, we come into these climate talks with governments having an unprecedented mandate from their citizens. If we remember, millions of people have been marching on the streets, calling on their governments to take action, to take urgent action on the climate emergency. We've seen the scale of the impacts fill our television screens in every single country in the world. We've seen the impacts of floods and droughts and famines. And of course, at the same time, we've also seen unprecedented protests taking place around the world about economic inequality. It's clear that the world is broken, governments needed to act. So you would have expected governments to come knowing that this was a critical moment and to come with ambition. And instead we saw the United States, aided and abetted by other rich developed countries, take a wrecking ball to those outcomes. So first of all, governments came not willing to take action in terms of the lost decade, when they've literally done nothing in the previous decade, which has meant that the critical actions that are required in the coming decade are much, much harder. They attempted to block any support for poorer developing countries. As you just heard from Tasneem, I mean, this is absolutely outrageous. And what they were actually asking for, not just the United States, but the European Union as well, is basically to have no liability for the damage that their inaction is causing. And more heinous than that is not only are they not putting anything on the table in terms of genuine emission reductions or the desperately needed finance, what they wanted was loopholes so that their big polluting companies could continue to pollute. Loopholes that would basically bust the budget for the 1.5 degree guardrail. So we're coming here with governments with no willingness to act, and actually acting not in the interests of their citizens, but acting in the interests of their big polluting companies. And it was an absolute disaster. So the question now we must ask ourselves is, what will it take for our voices to be heard? Now, the climate talks moved to the UK in 2020. It's an unprecedented moment. We're at the end of the decade, the lost decade, and now we're in the beginning of the new decade. If governments don't come with that willingness, then which we can only as citizens force them and hold our own governments to account at a national level so that they come with the right mandates, I think we're talking about not just losing the 1.5 degree, but the 2 degree. And just to put that in context, because I totally agree with you, sometimes these climate words don't quite have the resonance. But the difference between the Ice Age and now was only 4 degrees. And already in the pledges that we've got for the Paris Agreement, we're seeing warming that will lead to 3 degrees. We have absolutely no idea of what the world will look like. But what we can say is that the impacts on the poorest people, on the most vulnerable around the world, will be absolutely devastating.
You're on the committee for Glasgow next year, where COP26 will take place. So explain the significance of this 5-year period from the Paris Climate Accord, and what it means if President Trump succeeds in pulling the U.S. out. It will be a day after the election. It will be for the Glasgow summit.
Yes, it will be before the Glasgow summit. So the Glasgow summit is seen as the critical moment when either governments will come to with a promise to increase their weak pledges for the 2020 to 2030, which is formally when the so-called Paris Agreement kicks in. They have to come with more willingness to be able to put finance on the table and to recognise that the support that's needed, the so-called loss and damage, needs to move forward. And what even after 40 hours of an extended climate negotiations, which limped across the finishing line, much of the decisions were then kicked into touch and were left for next year. So next year is really a make or break. And I think genuinely people will ask themselves after COP26, if it doesn't deliver the ambition, what is that UN process for? And how do we actually genuinely get more action? Because clearly our governments are not being able to deliver it in the UN process.
This is a youth activist from the Polish Ecological Club addressing the climate negotiators on that final day, Sunday, of negotiations.
Civil society has been shut out of this COP. Our lives, children and future generations are in your hands, and you are failing us. Do you want to be remembered as the ones who had the chance to act, but decided not to? As betrayers of our generation, of indigenous people, and of communities desperately fighting on the ground? We are rising, we are fighting, and we will win. COPs have failed people and the planet. People power, climate justice, now. Thank you.
So that's a youth activist from the Polish Ecological Club addressing the negotiators on Sunday. In Madrid, Spain, the COP ended on Sunday. And I wanted to go to the Washington Post, which is reporting a growing number of Americans describe climate change as a crisis. 2/3 say President Trump is doing too little to tackle the problem. The results from a poll conducted by the Washington Post and Kaiser Family Foundation point to a growing disconnect between Americans worried about the warming planet and Trump administration officials who've aggressively scaled back Obama-era environmental regulations and relinquished the nation's role as a global leader in pushing for climate action. Now, the numbers are amazing. The poll finds, this again is from the Washington Post, that a strong majority of Americans, about 8 in 10, say human activity is fueling climate change, and roughly half believe action is urgently needed within the next decade if humanity is to avert its worst effects. Nearly 4 in 10 now say climate change is a crisis, up from less than a quarter 5 years ago. Tasneem Essop in Cape Town, South Africa, we give you the last word here, and it is around the awareness, especially young people, have brought to the world around the urgency of this problem and where you see that activism going now, even if the COP was a monumental failure.
Yes, we recognize that this is going to be in our hands. So citizens across the world, the youth, indigenous, women, the workers, all of us have to be united. It is amazing the youth leadership on this issue in the past year, of course, putting the issue of the science firmly on the agenda, the fact that we are in a climate emergency. And so together with the rising up of young people today and the very many peoples across the world who have been fighting this on the front lines, who have been losing their lives for protecting the environment and to address, the extractive industries like the fossil fuel companies destroying the planet and have sacrificed their lives for this. This kind of growing unity is becoming more and more clear and stronger. And I think, as Assad said, linked to the protests on the economic injustices and the social injustices, I think that what we can witness and what we're going to witness is much bigger, powerful movements across the world and holding their governments into account. But not only just accountability, there has to be consequences for their inaction. So I think, Amy, we are going to see, I believe, much stronger movements. They're not going to tolerate inaction by their governments, whether, not just developed countries, but in all of the countries, the major emitters like South Africa, for example, will also be witnessing movements against the kind of continued use of coal in the country. So, yeah, I think that the hope now will have to come from us, the people. And some of this unity was already demonstrated in the UNFCCC process now in the past 2 weeks, and it can only grow stronger and stronger.
Tasneem Essop, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of the Climate Action Network International, speaking to us from Cape Town, South Africa, where she has just arrived back from the Madrid COP, and Asad Rehman, Executive Director of War on Want, speaking to us from London. To see all of our coverage of the UN Climate Summit, we've just returned from Madrid. You can go to democracynow.org. When we come back, impeachment with Ralph Nader. Stay with us.
'Cause I ain't gonna let you down, gonna lift you up, yeah, yeah, yeah. 'Cause I'm coming from a new world. Gonna let my light shine all over the world. I'm gonna let my light shine, yeah, yeah. Children of the world, this is our day. Brothers and sisters, this is our day.
Let Your Light Shine by Willie Dale. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This week, Donald Trump is set to become the third president to be impeached when the Democrat-controlled House votes Wednesday on 2 charges related to his effort to pressure Ukraine to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. The vote will send the charges to the Republican-controlled Senate to hold a trial on whether to remove Trump from office. On Sunday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer proposed terms for an evidentiary trial in the Senate that would start on January 7th and go beyond the investigation conducted by the House. Witnesses that could be called to testify include former National Security Advisor John Bolton and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. This comes as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell faces calls to recuse himself from Trump's impeachment trial after McConnell said last week he's, quote, taking his cues from the White House. This is McConnell speaking on Fox News.
Everything I do during this, I'm coordinating with White House counsel. There will be no difference between the president's position and our position as to how to handle this.
Meanwhile, on Sunday, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was questioned by Face the Nation host Margaret Brennan about coordinating with the White House on impeachment.
Should Republicans in the Senate really be taking their marching orders from the person being investigated?
I understand the president's frustration, but I think what's best for the country is to get this thing over with. I am clearly made up my mind. I'm not trying to hide the fact that I have disdain for the accusations in the process.
A new Fox poll says 54% of Americans want Trump impeached. I repeat, this is a Fox poll, which also says 50% want him impeached and removed. I repeat, Fox poll says half of Americans want Trump removed. Early this morning, the House Judiciary Committee released its full report on Trump's impeachment. That's nearly 700 pages and explains in 4 parts the committee's justification for recommending 2 articles of impeachment against Trump: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by 3-time presidential candidate, consumer activist and author Ralph Nader. He's called for impeaching Trump for deliberately abetting the climate crisis, among other issues. His latest book, written with Mark Green, is titled Fake President: Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS, except he spells it out. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Ralph. So first, respond to what is happening this week. It is historic. What do you think about the grounds on which President Trump is about to be impeached?
Far too narrow and perilous. If Nancy Pelosi wants to remove Donald Trump, she went on a very narrow base. She is clearly not supportive of impeachment generally. She took it off the table when it was proposed to her in 2007, the impeachment of the war criminals, George Bush and Dick Cheney. And she's come forward with a very narrow hand for the most impeachable president of all time. To go forward on the Ukraine, important as that is, because it affects interference in the upcoming election by Trump, soliciting foreign aid into interference, not just the Ukraine effort. He's actually said China, Russia, help him. But just think of all the other impeachable offenses, some of them per se, that are kitchen table offenses. He's destroyed, shredded, disabled the life-saving, injury prevention, and disease reduction programs of the federal government, Environmental Protection Agency, the OSHA, protecting worker safety, the Product Safety Commission. He's basically closed down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, protection from Wall Street and other financial crimes against ordinary people, consumers, investors, small savers. That is a critical impeachable offense, according to the framers of our Constitution. The defiant refusal to faithfully execute the laws. She didn't go with that. The enrichment of his family with foreign governments using his hotels, the so-called emoluments clause, slam dunk per se. She didn't go with that. The seizure of the power of the purse, the appropriations power of the Congress, exclusively reserved to the Congress by the Constitution. She didn't go with that. He took $3.7 billion from the Defense Department to build the wall. That's a clear impeachable offense. It even gets worse, Amy. A month ago or so, Speaker Pelosi came to a press conference and said decisively that he committed bribery, said well documented, and she dropped the bribery impeachable clause. The whole obstruction of Congress is restricted largely to the Ukraine investigation, when he has the broadest contempt of Congress of any president, including, by the way, armed force in 9 countries overseas without any congressional declaration of war. And there is more as well. So the question is, why the Democrats didn't take a stronger stand and go with a strong hand that would have sharply increased public opinion because of the kitchen table issues, the health and safety and economic situations that he has fostered. Just look, average life expectancy is down. Productivity of labor is down. Manufacturing employment is down under Trump. These are not impeachable offenses, but the point is that he's vulnerable on these points, and he's a lying machine. I always thought that Alexander Hamilton's definition, one of his definitions of high crimes and misdemeanors, was the abuse of the public trust. Consider this. He is a sexual predator. Where's Congress on that? They got rid of Franken and John Conyers for 1% of what Trump has done. He's embroiled in all kinds of lawsuits by women who have sworn under oath that he's assaulted them, harassed them, etc. Then you have the bigotry and the racism, which he follows up with. I mean, his policies come down very hard on minority and the poor. And then you have his incitement to violence. If he's impeached, civil war, there'll be riots in the street. And then you cluster those under serial lying. He lies by the hour, lies by the day. He's averaging 22 lies, over 14,000 since he came into office. And you have an abuse of the public trust. People understand that. They don't want to have neighbors. They don't want to raise their children with this kind of model in the White House: lying, misogyny, racism, incitement to violence. So she has forfeited a huge opportunity, not just to impeach Trump, but to remove him. What's the point of just impeaching him if you don't use the full arsenal of impeachable offenses? And what a lot of people don't know, I've been down on Capitol Hill, and most of the Democratic members of the House Judiciary Committee opposed her narrow approach, but they were overruled. They were even backed by the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Engel, by the chair of the Financial Committee, Congresswoman Maxine Waters. The obstruction of justice in the Mueller report, where he had about 10 documented obstruction of justices, that was even supported by her deputy, the number 2 person, Steny Hoyer from Maryland. So she overruled them all. And as a result, I don't think she's protecting those 10 or 12 new members of Congress from Trump. He's going after them already. And he's crowing. He's taunting her. He's saying Nancy Pelosi has the majority in the House, and she didn't go forward with all these charges. And don't you know why? Because they're all lies. They're all fake. That's why. I've done nothing wrong. So he's taunting her, and he will do it before hundreds of thousands of people in his rallies in the coming months. A huge lost opportunity.
Ralph Nader, you also wrote a column saying Trump should be impeached for his climate policy alone as we come out of this COP25, this UN climate summit in Madrid, that has been called a monumental failure, with many blaming it partially on the United States, even though the climate-denying President Trump is pulling the U.S. out of the accord, not before they helped to water down these negotiations.
Well, he's done a lot worse. He's completely unleashed the fossil fuel industry, drilling in the Arctic, drilling overseas, drilling on the shores. He's unleashed these massive greenhouse gases. He had an opportunity as president either to ignore climate disruption, and climate change should never be used. It's climate crisis, climate violence, climate disruption. We've got to use the right words here. He could have ignored it. He could have worked to diminish greenhouse gases. Instead, he's actually expanding greenhouse gases. Now, the Pentagon years ago declared climate disruption as a national security danger, and they continue to do so. Even the Federal Reserve is beginning to speak up on this. But Donald Trump calls it a hoax. He calls it a Chinese plot. This is instability. This is a psychiatric problem. This is a president who does not defend our country against a fossil fuel unleashed, ravaging nature with massive droughts and massive floods and ocean currents beginning to change and melting glaciers and all kinds of critical assaults on the security of the United States and its people, on farmers, on the poor, on the shore, all of that. And that's not an impeachable offense? I mean, what's the Congress up to here?
Well,
we're
Ralph,
dealing here. Yes.
Let me ask you, even if they haven't gotten him on all of these different issues, let's go back to Nixon. One of the articles of impeachment that was being drafted that was not approved was for the secret bombing of Cambodia. Regardless, he was gotten on, for example, abuse of power. Ultimately, he resigned, and he didn't go through that impeachment process. But regardless of what he is charged with, does it matter if he is impeached? And then talk about what this means as it goes to the Senate, where you have the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying he probably won't call witnesses, although I think that's in flux, saying he's consulting with White House lawyers, et cetera. Talk about why it matters if he is impeached.
Well, it matters certainly for some people in this country that the House of Representatives has, in effect, indicted him under its constitutional authority and is sending over for trial in the Senate. But Mitch McConnell's a total dictator to the Senate. He is an outlaw. He's actually invited the defendant, Donald Trump, to set the rules of the trial by the senators who are the jury. I mean, I don't know whether Chief Justice Roberts wants to participate in such a kangaroo court. But the tragedy is there aren't enough articles of impeachment that should have been passed through the House. We have a 12-count articles of impeachment on the website nader.org, developed by constitutional law experts, including Bruce Fine and the legendary constitutional law expert for the Library of Congress, now retired, Lou Fisher. For those of you who want to see the missed opportunities here, when you go after a president, you want to remove him. You don't go after him with a narrow hand and a get it over series of hearings. It's truly tragic to see this opportunity, and he glories in it. He's doubling down. He is going to continue nourishing these impeachment offenses, not like Nixon slinking back into the corner. He's going to turn it into an advantage for him to the extent that he can.
Ralph Nader, we're going to break and then come back to our discussion and also turn to Boeing, which for you is a personal tragedy as well as a global tragedy. Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, former presidential candidate. His latest book, written with Mark Green, Fake President, Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS. Stay with us.
If I'm butter them, he's a hot knife. He makes my heart a cinema scope. We show him a dancing bird of paradise. If I'm butter, if I'm butter, then he's a hot knife. He makes my heart a cinema scope. We show him a dancing bird of paradise. He excites me, must be like the Genesis rhythm. I get feisty whenever I'm with him. If I'm butter, if I'm butter. If I'm better than he's a hot knife, he makes my heart a cinema scope. Showing a dancing bird of paradise. I'm a hot knife, I'm a hot knife, I'm a hot knife, he's a pat of butter. If I get a chance, I'm gonna show him that he's never gonna need another, never need another. If I'm butter, if I'm butter, if I'm butter, then he's a hot knife. He makes my heart a chance, I'm gonna show him that he's never gonna need another, never need another. If I'm butter,
Hot Knife, Fiona Apple, here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to developments in the safety of Boeing's 737 MAX airplane. Last week, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee held a hearing on the safety of the airplane, which has been grounded worldwide after 2 crashes in Ethiopia and Indonesia that killed all 346 people on board. This is former Boeing manager Edward Pearson, who testified he tried to warn executives 4 months before the first deadly crash.
I believe production problems at the Renton factory may have contributed to these 2 tragic crashes, but I don't believe our regulators are paying enough attention to that factory, and I'm calling for further investigation. I formally warned Boeing leadership in writing on multiple occasions, specifically once before the Lion Air crash and again before the Ethiopian Airlines crash, about potential airplane risk due to the unstable operating environment within the factory. Those warnings were ignored. I requested a one-on-one meeting with the general manager on July 18th and repeated my recommendation to shut down the factory for a brief period of time. When I mentioned that I've seen operations in the military shut down for lesser safety concerns, I will never forget his response, which was, the military isn't a profit-making organization.
That was former Boeing manager Ed Pearson testifying last week before Congress. Samia Stumo, great niece of our guest, Ralph Nader, died on the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 in March. We want to turn right now to her mother, to Nadia Milaron, who is the niece of Ralph Nader, Samia's mother. They have filed a lawsuit against Boeing and a claim against the Federal Aviation Administration.
This is not an accident. This is something that could have been prevented. And as somebody who's lost a dearest person in my life, you know, I want her death not to be in vain. I don't want anybody else to die.
Ralph Nader, this is a personal tragedy for you, but also a global tragedy. And because you've been a consumer advocate for so long, you have made these global corporate catastrophes very personal for everyone. And again, our condolences to your whole family on the loss of Samia, a beautiful, young, brilliant activist who was going to Africa to work on issues there when she died in that flight. Talk about the latest on Boeing.
Well, the latest is more and more disclosures, more and more whistleblowers. You have John Barnett, the quality control inspector for the plant in South Carolina, the 777 Boeing, saying essentially what Edward Pearson said. We have mounting evidence brought forth by the House Transportation Committee that the FAA knew a lot more than it made out publicly, that it became an abdicator under pressure from Congress of past years instead of a regulator. And the thunderbolt that just came out a few days ago was that in December 2018, after the Indonesian crash, there was a risk assessment by the FAA that these planes, they have orders for 5,000 of these dangerous planes, the 737 MAX, would have 15 crashes over the 40-year life of the plane, taking 2,900 lives. And that was not released by the FAA, month after month of cover-up. The two people are responsible for the FAA's abdication and giving Boeing the power of self-certification in its factories. Elwell and El Bahrami are still there in the FAA. Steve Dixon is the new FAA administrator. They're still there. And the board of directors for Boeing that presided over these trails of criminal negligence and failure to attend to aerodynamic stability, they're still there. And the CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg, paid millions and millions of dollars a year. He's still there. So until they are replaced, we cannot see light at the end of the tunnel. And the light at the end of the tunnel is not trying to use a hoked-up, glitch-ridden software in the cockpit, MCAS it's called, a software fix for a hardware defect. You got to recall the planes, and Boeing has got to develop engineering adjustments and engineering changes so that plane is not prone to stall, which is, of course, what led to the crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, killing 346 innocent people. That's where it's got to be now. And Senator Wicker's got to get his Senate Oversight Committee active, along with the activity by Congressman Peter DeFazio.
This latest news that executives at Boeing are reportedly considering ending production of the 737 MAX passenger jet. Announcement might come this afternoon.
Yes, well, that was actually expected because they've got these jets they've been producing in recent months, 42 a month, over one a day. These are jets that sell for $130 million each. They've got them parked and stored, and they're running out of space. The airlines are furious with the way Boeing has maneuvered this whole thing. They're filing lawsuits to recover their financial losses. The labor unions for the airlines, they're doing the same thing. So this is just another step toward what I think has to be the recall of these planes and the engineering adjustments so that the basic problem, not a software fix, the basic problem is dealt with.
You also sent a letter to the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, urging Canada to do an independent review of the 737 MAX. Why is this so important in Canada right now, Ralph?
Because when all the other countries grounded the MAX in March of this year, there were two left, Canada and the U.S. And the U.S. was stubbornly saying, from the CEO of Boeing to the FAA to President Trump, don't worry, it's a safe plane. Yeah, 2 crashes in a few months of a brand new plane. Yeah, it's a safe plane. And Canada decided to ground them, and that clinched the necessity for the U.S. So Canada, if Canada ungrounds the plane along with the FAA, that's going to be a bad scene. If Canada holds firm, independent with Transport Canada, the U.S. will have to think twice about ungrounding the plane because it's hard to fly in North America without flying over Canadian airspace. So I wrote to Prime Minister Trudeau urging him to retain an independent evaluation, full certification, full simulator training for the pilots are the 2 demands that the families of the victims are making before Congress, for the FAA, before the media in the United States. So we are reliant on Canada if the FAA and Donald Trump are going to crumble. I mean, Trump is not looking good on this issue. He's very big business oriented. He's running a corrupt government of corporatism, militarism, and nepotism. You're not going to rely on him. So that's why I appeal to Canada. And people who want to get involved here, we've got a consumer boycott of the 737 MAX, should it ever be ungrounded. Go to flyersrights.org. That's run by Mr. Hudson, who lost his daughter in the Lockerbie explosion over Scotland. And it's a wonderful consumer group. People should join it. And they have all kinds of up-to-date material on the 737 MAX. I mean, tens of millions of you are going to fly this monster unless you get involved, unless you put the pressure on members of Congress as well.
Do you think Boeing executives should be forced to fly in 737 MAXs akin to air marshals as an extra safety measure?
Well, they are going to go up on these flights, but, you know, they're very careful flights. Everybody's on alert. They're not flying all over the world with pilots, say, that are less trained because they don't have military experience the way many of our pilots have, or different kinds of weather patterns or other kinds of things. So they will go up and say, see, Muhlenberg will go up, see, I went up, the head of the FAA, see, I went up. You're not dealing with that kind of situation. The FAA itself reduced the probability of a crash to 1 out of 1 million flights instead of the usual standard of 1 out of 10 million flights. These are crashes due to the design and construction of the plane, not crashes due to pilot error.
Ralph, what you're calling for in your family's lawsuit?
I didn't hear. Sorry.
What you're calling for in your family's lawsuit, very quickly.
We're calling for full compensation for the losses. We're calling for Boeing to contribute to establishing nonprofit institutions dedicated to airline safety. We're calling for full disclosure with depositions. The lawyers who do these depositions get a lot more information under oath by Boeing officials and ex-Boeing people than the Congress has managed to. So these will all begin to reveal their impact in the spring. The depositions will probably start in the spring.
Finally, different issue. Last Wednesday, 180 House Democrats joined almost all House Republicans in voting in favor of a massive $750 billion military spending bill for the Pentagon, one of the largest military spending bills in U.S. history. In the last 30 seconds we have, your response.
So this is the trade-off the Democrat Party has been making for years. With every $1 billion to the Defense Department, they get some money for social safety net. So they just gave Boeing, they just gave the Department of Defense another $22 billion, which would have renovated 22,000 elementary schools in this country in return for paid family leave for federal employees. What kind of trade-off is that? There should be paid family leave without increasing the huge waste and corruption. of the military budget, which is devouring infrastructure needs in this country.
Ralph, we have to leave it there. I want to thank you so much for being with us. Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, former presidential candidate. His latest book, written with Mark Green, Fake President, Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS. And that does it for our show. A very happy birthday to Renee Feltz and to my brother Steve. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. Thanks to Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.